the Practical Prophetic, where prophetic ministry is made practical. I'm Beth Wingate, I'm your host, and welcome to the podcast. On our podcast today, we have an episode of Prophetic History. It's been a minute since we've done one of these, and I'm really excited to share with you the story I have for you today. And it's about Dr. Lester Sumrall, his life story. He's impacted our family. I know that he was a mentor to people I listened to. He's been a mentor to people like Rod Parsley, Dr. Billy Brown. The list is probably so long we couldn't even list all the people he's impacted. He's been known across the world as the father of Christian television. He was one of the first that had like a regular teaching program, and he began to, in the 50s, to buy up television programs and do evangelism through television. But I want to back up and give you his story because it all started with a vision that God gave him. In fact, he had two visions in his early ministry. And so this is an important story that I had to bring to the podcast audience because this, in essence, explains NABA. It was this vision, this supernatural communication from the Lord, prophetic communication from the Lord that changed his life. First, by him becoming a Christian, and second, by really shaping his ministry. And so I've even got some excerpts where you can hear it in his own words, but let me get started with Dr. Sumrall. He was born in 1913 in New Orleans, Louisiana, to Betty and George Sumrall. George Sumrall was a big man. He was Irish, and he worked with heavy equipment, and so he was very strong, big man. His father was very worldly and was not a Christian, and his mother, though, was a praying Christian who really loved the Lord, very devout. And so in his early life, he was more influenced by his father than his mother. And when he was about 17 years old, he began to experience symptoms of tuberculosis. In fact, he became bedridden. He would have a lot of coughing and would cough up blood all the time. And the doctors had basically given him no hope. He had gotten really bad around the time that he was 17 years old. And his mother began to pray for him and brought in some women to help pray for him. And they were living in Panama City, Florida during this time. And so I'm going to let him share with you about this first vision that he had that led to his conversion experience.
The two visions that I've had. The first one happened when I was 17 years of age. Out of the sheer tender mercies of God, I was a rebellious young man. I'd been sick with tuberculosis for at least 18 months, I suppose. I had been in bed with it between 5 and 6 months. And so it had been some time. And I'd gotten down to the place of death. We lived in Panama City, Florida, on St. Andrews Bay, right by the waterside, just right down the bluff there. That was a sand. We were into the water of St. Andrews Bay. Beautiful place to live. My room was made up of 24 windows that on all four sides, only windows and casings, and the sunlight and the fresh air was all there. You see, except I was dying of tuberculosis, and it came down to one day when the doctor said that I would be dead in 2 hours. And I didn't know that. He told my parents that. And he told my daddy, he says, drop by my office tomorrow morning and I will have a death certificate made out for Lester, and pick it up, take it to the cemetery, and you can purchase a lot for his burial. He'll be dead in 2 hours. And he left. That was it. But I didn't die. On one side of me, I saw a beautiful casket, just the size of the bed. They're beautiful. Yeah, lovely. Except it was just my size, and that's awkward. And I looked at it, and I didn't like it, so I turned my head the other way. And when I did, I saw a Bible from the floor to the ceiling, the biggest Bible I've ever seen. And God spoke to me and said, "You will choose one of those now." I said, "Now?" I was born in New Orleans. We make decisions very slow. God said, "You're going to choose between that casket, filling it tonight, or you're going to choose between speaking my word according to the word from that Bible." And I said, "Well, I'm not really ready for either one of them. I'm not ready to die, and I'm not ready to live either." well, the Lord says you're going to do it tonight. And I said, let me get well and go back to church and I'll do it. God said, no, you don't have any more sunrises and you don't have any more church. You've had all you're going to have. You're going to make a decision now. And I was looking at it. And I looked at the Bible, as big as the wall. I looked at the casket, open, beautiful, just my size. And I slowly said, I don't want that casket. I'm not ready to die. I don't want to die. And I said, but I don't want to preach either. But anyway, I'd rather preach than to die. And so I said, Lord, if the only way I can live is to preach, then I will preach. And I'll carry the word wherever you like. And I dropped off to sleep. And I woke up the next morning completely well. Can you imagine that? Completely well. Yeah, I had seen a vision, of course, just as real as the prophets of God. I'd seen a vision. And it was a glorious revelation, of the Most High God. I had seen it. But while I slept, God took tuberculosis out of my system. I'd had that tubercular fever for about 6 months. They couldn't break it. I hurt in every bone in my body, but they couldn't do anything about it, And blood came up out of my lungs every day and every night, coughing it up. And the doctor said I had 2 hours to live. And that night, while I slept, I was healed. God healed me. He took it out. So I have a lot to be thankful to God for.
After God healed Lester Sumrall, he said he got to feeling stronger. He asked his mom to make him his favorite meal. Of course, she didn't understand that he was healed at this point, and she thought to herself, well, sometimes right before people die, they'll have this little burst of energy, and I'll just make this as if it's his last meal. And of course, it wasn't. He got better and better, and in fact, he said later that week, he went fishing at St. Andrews Bay in Panama City, and he said that when he got back home, the Lord reminded him that he had told the Lord that he would preach, that he was called to preach. And he said, so he made the decision to pack a bag and to go preach. He didn't have a car. He didn't have a plan. He didn't know much about the Bible. His dad actually kind of mocked him and made fun of him. And when he was headed out the door, he said he ran into a friend of his at the bus stop. And this other guy, he told him, what he was doing. And his friend said, well, why don't I go with you? And he said, you're going to need a musician. And he said, well, do you play anything? And he's like, well, not really. And so the two of them set out to go be evangelists. Him and his friend went out to these little bitty backwood country churches to go preach revival services. And he said that it was pretty much a failure. All he had was his story of being healed, and many people did not believe him, and so he didn't know what he was doing. And so that's around the time. Now he's around 17, 18 years old at this time, and this is when he has his second vision.
In a little frame building in the state of Tennessee, I had a song leader along with me, traveling with me, a young man, a year or two older than I, and he was up in front leading the congregation in some song, and I was sitting on the side looking at him, waiting for my time to preach, and I lost him, and in a vision. Now the first vision was on a bed at home, just as bright as crystal, just as clear as anything here in the office. My second vision was in a church. Not a church, really, a little frame building up in Tennessee, and there'd be 100 people present, maybe. Well, in those Depression days, that seemed like a lot of people. But anyway, I lost them. I couldn't see them, and I saw the whole world. Now, at that time, I had never seen a missionary convention. I'd never seen much of foreigners. We had no television, of course. And so I didn't know how people dressed or how they looked. And suddenly my spirit, my soul, saw the whole world. I saw the nations of the world, the Chinese, the Japanese, the Mongolians, the Manchurians. I saw all the nations of the world. And they were on a road they were on a road, and God picked me up out of my body, took me to the end of the road, and I saw the world go to hell. Now, I had tried to preach on hell very poorly, I presume, for that 18 months. But I saw the world go to hell. I became aghast. I suddenly saw what preaching was all about. It was to save people from hell. But I didn't know how bad hell was until I saw it in the vision. You see, I saw it. And then they got to the end of the road. These people fell off the precipice into eternity. And the ones behind them pushed them over. The compact, whoop, and knocked them into eternity. When they get to the end of the road, they wanted to back up. But the ones behind were under such pressure until it catapulted them into hell, screaming, crying, and tearing their face, pulling their hair. And as I looked at the most dreadful sight I'd ever seen in my life, God spoke to me and said, "You're to blame for this." Oh, I said, "Not me. I don't know these people. They're all foreigners. I said, "I'm sorry for them, but no relationship to me yet." God said, "Yes, it is." Said, I didn't know it at the time. He quoted from Ezekiel chapter 3. He said, "If the ungodly commits his ungodly deeds and he dies in his ungodliness, I will require his blood at your hand unless you warn him of his ungodliness." I said, "What did you say, God? You mean a man in Africa that I've never seen can go to hell and I'm to blame?" Yeah. You mean a man in Japan can be lost and I'm to blame? Yeah. If the ungodly commits his ungodly deeds and he dies in his ungodliness and you don't warn him of his ungodliness, I will require his blood at your hand. I said, "Hey, why don't you tell everybody?" He says, "I have. It's in the book." I had to go find it in Ezekiel chapter 3. And I said, "Well, I'm to blame?" And I saw blood running between my fingers, human blood. And I awoke. And I said, "Dear God, I never dreamed of it." I began to weep. And I laid on the floor of that primitive little building where mud mixed with the perspiration from my body during that night. And I cried and I prayed until 8 o'clock the next morning. I cried so hard I had to open my eyes with my fingers. They glued to from crying so hard. I had hurt in my bones so hard. I'd never hurt like that except when I was dying of tuberculosis, you see. And this was 18 months later. And that night, when I was alone in that church because everybody else went home, and I was afraid to tell the vision. It was months before I told anybody about the vision. And I was afraid they say, "Oh, you're crazy, you're a fanatic or something." So I just kept it in my own spirit. And God said, "No, you can't do that. You have to tell it. You have to tell it." Immediately, something happened in me. Number one, I love lost souls. I cared for people. I began to speak in a different way. I began to love in a different way. I began to minister. I became a new person. Then I knew that I had to be a missionary. So I began to plan. I wrote the State Department about traveling out of the country, a passport. I talked to ministers. In those days, in the Depression days, not many people had been out of the country. Hardly anybody had been out of the country. So the information was very bare. But this happened 18 and a half months later. So 17, I saw the first one. 18 and a half, going on 19 years of age. 18 months after that, when I was 20 years of age, I left this country. And I went overseas as an evangelist to say what God told me to say.
So let me back up just a little bit. When Lester Sumrall was 19, he had planted a church in Arkansas named Green Forest Assembly of God, and he was ordained in the Assemblies of God. And in 1931, when he was around 20 years old, right before he was 20, he met a man named Howard Carter. Now, let me talk about Howard Carter for just a minute, because they became ministry companions, and really Carter became a mentor for Lester Sumrall. Carter was a man who was British from England, and he later would start the Assemblies of God in Great Britain and in Ireland. And so he was in Arkansas, and he was in his 40s, and he met Lester Sumrall, who had just, right around 19, 20 years old, and they began to talk. And he invited Sumrall to come with him on mission trips. Well, this is something God had already laid on Lester's heart, was to go and be a missionary. And so later that year, when he was 20 years old, he got on a boat in San Francisco, and Carter had already gone to Australia, and he was going to catch up and meet Howard Carter in Australia, and then they were going to go to New Zealand and then Tahiti and do one of these evangelistic missionary trips. And so he began to travel regularly with Howard Carter, and Howard Carter really began to tutor him in the things of God and in how to be a missionary, how to go about it. They often would ride on shipping boats, and he learned how to do, missionary travels pretty much on a dime. So throughout the Great Depression years, he would travel with Carter. He went all over Asia, pretty much all over the world, and he ended up in South America. In fact, they end up in Argentina. And while they were doing an evangelistic missionary trip in Argentina, and they would pretty much, wherever they went, they would stay there a couple of, 2-3 months and kind of establish ministries or reinforce ministries or have tent meetings in the areas, and then they would move on. And so they were in Argentina, and he was invited to one of the local churches there to a wedding. And while he was at the wedding with Carter, he noticed that there was a young lady playing the organ, and so she was doing the music for this wedding, and her name was Louise Lehman. She was a Canadian missionary, very young girl who's a Canadian missionary. She played piano, and she played the accordion, and she played the organ. Well, at this moment, she was playing an organ for this wedding, and they began to strike up a friendship. And later, he would begin to write to her. They were kind of pen pals there for a while. And a few months later, they decided to get married, and that became Lester Sumrall's wife. Her name's Louise Lehman. She was from Canada, but she was a missionary in Argentina, and so that's how they met. And then basically, he said their honeymoon consisted of them going on a trip. They were invited to go up the Amazon River. And so they went deep into the Amazon to do missionary work. In fact, he said they often had to sleep in hammocks. And he said, not very romantic. So they're traveling and doing missionary work. And along the trip, to fund their passage to come back home for furlough, they had to sell her accordion. And she kind of teases him a little bit about that in an interview later that they did together. They'll go on to have 3 sons, all of whom are ministers. So that's pretty incredible. In the 1950s, the family, now they were regularly missionaries. They would, go out on the mission field. And in the 50s, they moved to the Philippines. In fact, throughout the 50s, the Sumrall family was mostly in the Philippines. In fact, Lester Sumrall would establish Cathedral of Praise Church. And at one time, it was in Manila, one of the largest churches in the world, and it had about 24,000 members, which in 1950 was just absolutely unheard of. And so he was doing amazing things over in the Philippines. Well, in 1956, now while he was in Manila, he would take a few months out of the year, or summer or whatever, and go to other places. And in 1956, him and his young family, happened to be in Israel. And while they were in Israel, the 1956 Sinai-Suez crisis happened. It's considered one of the Arab-Israeli wars, and they were there in Jerusalem as witnesses to that war, which was just also amazing. But he's mainly stationed out of the Philippines at this time, out of Manila at his home church that he had planted. And he said that it was during this time, around 1957, that God called him to withdraw from Asia and to come back to the United States. The Lord speaks to him and tells him, go home to America, and he told him, he said, I'm going to give you 1 million souls through television. In fact, he said he kind of argued with the Lord and was like, I'm really happy here in the Philippines. I love it here. Our church is thriving. We're doing amazing work for the kingdom. He didn't want to leave, and he's like, I'm not really interested in television. But the Lord called him to have 1 million souls through television. And so he said the Lord actually gave him 7 future events that would happen and really begin to speak to him. In fact, he's one of the end time preachers, prophecy preachers. He's like a pioneer of end times prophecy preaching. And so he was doing it before everybody, even before Hal Lindsey. And so Lester Sumrall is really amazing. And then so around 1957, later that year, he comes back. He founded the Lester Sumrall World Evangelistic Association. He founded World Harvest Bible College in Indiana and World Harvest Magazine. So he got right to work. He was really serious about it. He said the Lord spoke to him and told him that even though he's been going into the mission field of the world, that the United States is one of the biggest mission fields because people have religion there, but they don't always have relationship. And so he was very passionate about that. For about 10 years, he was just all about building that ministry here in the United States. And in 1968, he founded the World Harvest Missionary Evangelism, and he was always passionate about missions and evangelism, and so he began to raise up and train up missionaries and send them out. Just amazing. This is around this time he begins to, from like the early 70s until his death, he acquired many small television networks, satellite networks, and he began to build a network that he called the Lester Sumrall Network. And so he began to pioneer Christian television. He was doing it before most people, and not just him having a show, but he would produce and have people have their own shows on his network. So he was sort of way ahead of his time, ahead of TBN and PTL and Daystar and all of those. He was doing it before any of those people were. When it was all analog and it was all small, independent, local stations that just sort of beamed out locally, he had acquired all of those that he could, and then he was doing really early work before cable and before satellite in that area. He'll go on to develop what he called the World Feeding Program. He was very passionate about that. And in 1996, at the age of 83, he would pass away. Now, he mentored Rod Parsley. He mentored Billy Brim. In fact, she was actually a ghostwriter for Kenneth Hagin, and then she worked for Lester Sumrall for a time and helped him write some of his books. And she has some amazing stories about him. Rod Parsley tells stories. I'll just interject a couple of stories about him. He was known in India. There was a famous person that was, possessed of devils, and in a large meeting, he prayed for that person, and that person was delivered from, possession, and it was just amazing. It was heard all over the world. It was really sensational at the time. And he would, in 55 years of ministry, he would minister in over 110 countries. Amazing. And so Lester Sumrall has a special place in history, and I've just scraped the very tip of the iceberg. But I wanted to hone in on the fact that he had these dreams, these visions from the Lord that really changed the trajectory of his life. Well, I'm going to leave us today with a story that Rod Parsley tells about the time that Lester Sumrall, when he was in a foreign country, encountered a witch doctor who was trying to put a curse, on people, and the encounter that Lester Sumrall had with him while he was a missionary. And so this is an amazing story. It's told from Parsley's point of view. Remember, Parsley was mentored by Lester Sumrall. And so I'm just going to leave us with this story, and I think it's an amazing story, and I'm just going to leave it with you guys now about Dr. Lester Sumrall.
My pastor, Dr. Lester Sumrall, early on in his ministry some 60 years ago, found himself in the jungles of Central America. While he was there, he came across a witch doctor Witch doctor was taking human blood, mixing it together with alcohol, pouring it into the mouth of a satanic bullfrog. Close the mouth of the frog, dance around and whirl and make satanic incantations. Then open the mouth of the frog and drink the mixture back out. My pastor didn't do what most pastors today would do. He didn't walk up to that man and say, by the way, next Tuesday, we can schedule an appointment for you at 2 o'clock in the afternoon with a staff psychiatrist at the church. He walked up to where that witch doctor was, slapped his hands on the sides of his head, and said, "Come out!" Everybody shout, "Come out!" We didn't come tonight to play with the devil. We didn't come tonight to play church. We didn't come tonight to patty cake. We didn't come tonight to watch some puppet placate the people's passions. We did not come in this house tonight to construct for ourselves some little token God in our own mind and intellect which would become conducive to the lifestyle which we have predisposed ourselves to live. If you did, you're in the wrong building. That witch doctor fell over with a thud on the ground. He got up a moment later, prayed the sinner's prayer, was baptized in the Holy Ghost with evidence of speaking in other tongues. My pastor went back to the home that he was staying in. At that time, they didn't have beautiful hotels like the bishop has been so kind to put me in this day. Went back to the home, had no air conditioning, lay down in his against the wall, pulled the covers up over himself and began to go to sleep. When suddenly the windows that were hanging, the curtains hanging over the windows began to flap and stick straight out. A horrible dark cloud filled the room. An eerie, damp coldness ate in his bones. And the bed that he was lying in began to shake violently up and down. It shook so violently that it moved all the way out into the middle of the floor. That's when my pastor raised up in the bed and said, "I recognize you, devil. I cast you out once today. I cast you out once. I can cast you out again. Now in the name of Jesus, go from me." He said immediately the bed settled down in the middle of the floor. The curtains lay back against the wall. The coldness left the room.
Thank you for listening to today's podcast. Please be sure to hit the subscribe button so you'll be informed next time I post. Thank you again and have a blessed day.